Top 10 decks for the end of April 2023. I just want to give a big shout out to everybody that came out last week and liked the video. Thank you so much. It was my most liked video for the entire week. Before we get into the top 10 decks for the week, we're going to talk about the changes and 4 cards specifically that are winners and losers. Leader was a big winner this week, largely replaced Leech and is getting used in a lot of different decks. We're going to talk about whether or not those decks are good or not in a moment, but definitely Leader was a big win for this week and seeing a lot more use. Super Scroll hype is real. Super Scroll dropped from Series 4 to Series 3 and is seeing significant play. I've also personally become a big fan of this card. SHURI. Rest in peace, SHURI. Massive changes to SHURI. Almost not seeing much gameplay from SHURI at all. That was the top deck for several months, and now other decks have a time to play. And in my opinion, this is the most open, diverse meta we've had in a long time. And then Leech. Not seeing Leech anymore, and I know a lot of people are happy about that. Now, there are 4 popular decks right now, and 2 of them I think are a tad overrated. And that's just my opinion, but if we look right here, we've got Electro, Darkhawk, Patriot, and then we've also got a junk deck, which is a Thanos deck, which I think is pretty good also. But the 2 decks that I'm talking about specifically that I think are largely being played a lot and may be overrated are going to be Electro and also Galactus. Now, of course, these are good decks if piloted by a skilled player. But isn't that true of every deck? If you're a good player, you're going to be able to take a deck list that you're familiar with. And I think that's going to be the overall theme of this video, is that there are a lot of decks that are viable that you can climb with. And it's going to come down to, are you comfortable with the deck? Do you enjoy playing the deck? Do you think the deck is fun? Do you know when to retreat? What matches are favorable to you? Which matches are unfavorable to you? Which locations are favorable to you? And largely a lot of that just has to do with playing the deck a lot. I do think Electro and Galactus decks are seeing a lot of play, but if I look at the overall cube rate, it's almost half of that of the other decks that we're going to talk about in this video. So right here is a typical Electro build. The difference between this and the weeks before is the addition of Leader. Largely replaced Leech. People subbed in Leader against Leech, and that is working just fine. I want to say also that the main slot that people are subbing out right here is Lizard, and oftentimes I will see other cards in this build other than Lizard with like Magneto, She-Hulk, sometimes Chavez, and my personal favorite, Jeff, which is a new addition, actually works pretty well in this deck. I did play a Sandman deck this week with Jeff the Land Shark, and I felt the synergy there with Electro and Sandman to be quite good, and so I thought that he was a good fit in this deck. Galactus. Now, people are still playing a lot of Galactus. Largely, this is an optimized build. There's 2 cards that get swapped out a lot, and that is Psylocke and Daredevil. Varying opinions on what is best, of course. Some people prefer to play Cloak to help out with pesky locations. Some people prefer to play with Spider-Man, and even other people prefer to play with Wolverine. My personal opinion is not so much that Psylocke is good, but I really like Daredevil. Probably for me, if I was going to play a Galactus build today, I'd play this with maybe like, say, Cloak and Daredevil. I think Daredevil is one of the best cards in this slot. Smart players know how to counter Galactus decks. They also know when to retreat. And Daredevil takes a lot of that guesswork out of the equation, where you're able to foresee if your opponent is going to do something to surprise and take advantage of the predictable nature of Galactus. Another Galactus build, which is different, that also runs Daredevil. And I gotta say that I highly recommend Daredevil in these Galactus builds. Is one that can go off on turn 6, has multiple win conditions, takes advantage of Shuri and Nimrod, and it does not necessarily need Galactus to win. So this is like a turn 6 2-win condition Galactus build. I have played this build quite a bit, and I think it is a little bit more complicated to play than the traditional Galactus style, but this gives more variance and it lends itself to the skilled player. Both of these decks and Electro Ramp, I feel, are a tad bit overrated at this time, and there are a ton of other decks out there that are doing better as far as cube rates, and they do well. And I know a lot of people just think that Galactus and Electro Ramp are unfun to play against, and I get that. I also would suggest playing them. I think if you take some time and actually play these decks, you will realize that they are temperamental, fragile, inconsistent, and sometimes easily countered. And I don't think they are a big deal at all. Like, I don't feel like complaining about Electro Ramp decks. I don't feel like complaining about Galactus decks. I just don't think they're that good. That's my opinion, and I just don't feel like it merits complaining because they are not impressive, in my opinion. Now, the best decks in the game, we're going to go over what I think are the best decks right now, and I largely feel that the best decks in the game come into one of two categories. And that is going to be Darkhawk decks and or Patriot decks. Now, I'm a personal fan of the Darkhawk decks, and there's a couple varieties of them. The most traditional variety of Darkhawk decks are running alongside a Devil Dino package. This one here, I personally like the most because it runs Cosmo and Doom. I know a lot of other people will run different cards instead of Cosmo or Dr. Doom, like Agent Coulson or Chavez or She-Hulk. There's a lot of versions of this deck that work very well, but I'm a big fan of Cosmo, which provides reasonable counterplay against Galactus, and Doom gives width. And Doom is probably one of the best standalone plug and play cards in the meta right now, and I think this is the best deck. Like, if I were to say out of all these decks we're going to go over here, I would say that this is the best deck. Now, staying in with this Darkhawk theme, the version that is also getting a lot of play and that is having phenomenal success in climbing the ranks on the leaderboard is going to be a Doomwave Darkhawk build. So it's like half Darkhawk, half Doomwave. Now, the idea with Wave is to play Wave on turn 5. That means you play your Darkhawk on turn 4. So you play Darkhawk on turn 4, and then on turn 5, you play Wave, but you save the 2 mana. That way, on turn 6, you will be able to play 2 cards, She-Hulk and some other card, and that just leaves open a lot of opponents. There are a ton of decks out there that like to drop their hand on turn 6, like this Darkhawk deck, right? Likes to drop his hand on turn 6. That's why I also like this deck right here, is that it runs Doom. So if you do come across Sandman or a Wave deck, you still have Doom as an option. It actually kind of takes all the advantages of Wave and Sandman and just gets rid of it because the deck runs Doom. So the idea here is, yeah, you play Wave on turn 5, float 2 mana, you're able to play She-Hulk for 2, and then you can play Shang-Chi, Dr. Doom, Darkhawk, Rock Slide, whatever you want to play at the same time and win the game. Polaris also is becoming one of my favorite cards. Be able to move a card around can be useful against Galactus. They're just very situational situations where she is just incredibly helpful. But more importantly, her stats are good. 3 cost, 5 mana. Big fan of Polaris. The other popular deck that is out there right now is Patriot, and Patriot is doing well. I believe this deck is also doing well in tournaments. Now, there's a couple ways of playing this deck. There's a lot of opportunity for surprise gameplay, why on turn 6 dropping Patriot and Mystique at the same time, or just drawing Ultron. Of course, this deck does not like Killmonger, but the newest addition to this deck, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, is Super Skrull. Now, there can be some downsides to Super Skrull, but I think Super Skrull is popping off right now in some ways because SHURI is going away, and SHURI decks ran things like Red Skull and Lizard, so you don't necessarily want Super Skrull against that type of deck, but against other types of deck, Super Skrull is amazing. My favorite thing to do with Super Skrull is against a Galactus player when it copies their null, and oftentimes you just win the game with Super Skrull because they play null, and then you play Super Skrull, and then you have more power out, and you win the game. Big fan of this deck. I feel like you have to decide early if you want to pop like Patriot, Mystique early in the match or late in the match, depending on whether or not you have Ultron or Onslaught in your hand. So there is some decisions to be made on this deck, and it easily is one of the top decks. So I feel like the most popular decks right now are Galactus, Electro Ramp, the Darkhawk decks, and Patriot decks. And in my opinion, the Darkhawk and the Patriot decks are superior in a lot of different ways. Another deck that is seeing a lot of play is Sarah Surfer. Now, I'm a big fan of Sarah Control, but I do think the server builds are just better. And the reason why these decks are coming back or coming up is because SHURI was a big problem. SHURI would put a lot of power out, and other decks like Patriot and Sarah Surfer just couldn't compete necessarily all the time with the raw power output of SHURI Red Skull, right? It was just kind of eliminated a lot of other types of archetypes. Now, the favorite thing about this deck is that it has a lot of meaningful counterplay to Galactus, whether that's Goose or Polaris pulling their Cloak or Daredevil into the lane that they're trying to play Galactus. Cards like Nova is typically wanted to play on turn 6, where you can play Nova and Killmonger at the same time. Juggernaut is a superstar. Typically, you want to play Juggernaut after you play Storm. I found that Juggernaut can be a little bit awkward after you've played Storm. If you did not play Juggernaut into the Storm lane, you can play Sarah on turn 5, snap, and then dump your hand, and there's just a ton of points. I did play this and make a video about this deck. I thought it was amazing. Easily refreshing to see some of the older archetypes be viable now that the meta is more balanced. And we're going to talk about 2 other archetypes that are viable, that are seeing a resurgence, largely because of the elimination of the oppressive SHURI meta, and that is the Lockjaw meta. Now, Lockjaw did undergo some changes. Now you can only play once per turn, which hurt the Thanos decks more than it did the traditional Lockjaw deck. And I call this a casino deck, if you will. I did make a video about this deck as well. I actually didn't think this deck would be that good, but I was pleasantly surprised on how consistent it can be. There is a lot of RNG. So if you like the casino idea, this deck has that. Lockjaw, Dracula, Jubilee. I also found that I use the tracking app, untapped.gg. A link to that is in the description, but that is this tool right here, which is basically the same thing as writing everything out that happens with pen and paper, tracking what cards are left in your deck. Largely takes the guesswork out of a deck like this. Like, I do think this deck would be quite a bit harder to play without that tracker. Link to untapped.gg is in the description. I am sponsored by them. Another deck that is an oldie but goodie. I don't think this is the top, but it is completely viable right now, and that is Discard. Now, Discard never really had a time to shine. It was largely overshadowed, but I want to promise you that people are playing Discard right now and are climbing with Discard. It's just amazing how many other archetypes are viable right now when we don't have an impressive meta. Right now, there's a lot of decks that can flourish. And again, I said this earlier in the video, it's largely going to depend on whether or not I understand the deck, understand which matchups are favorable, which matchups are unfavorable, when to snap, when to retreat, what locations are good, what locations are bad for that deck. So it's just like you don't have to just use the meta decks. You can use a deck that you like and that you are good at. In fact, there's probably 900 decks not on my list. If you're good at that deck, you can play it right now and win. It's just the way the meta is right now. If you're familiar with the deck, and I actually think that off-meta decks are going to make a resurgence. So I'll give you an example. I typically play against another streamer, someone that I've known for a long time by the name of Kraken Null. And he plays off-meta decks. Now, these decks may or may not be optimized. These decks may not be the best, but they're unpredictable. And when I see the cards he's playing, I am genuinely confused as to what's going on. Where when I play against a Galactus deck, I know exactly what they're going to do. And I have a plan. And I'm not going to give that player a lot of cubes. Galactus players are just not going to get a lot of cubes from me, right? You can take your cube, okay, bye now. Or I have a counterplay and I'm going to take a lot of cubes from them. But off-meta decks might be the way going forward. I'm just putting that out there right now. Off-meta decks might become a thing just due to their unpredictable nature and being difficult to understand how to play against them. And then we're going to wrap up the video with what I'm going to be exploring today. So if you're a follower of this channel, expect a video. I'm going to be playing this deck a lot today on stream. It has Super Scroll in it, which I'm a huge fan of right now. And this is a Lockjaw Thanos build. And I played this quite a bit over the weekend and it just works. Like, this deck just gets cubes. It looks like a pile of cards. But when I started playing it, there's something here, and I think this is going to be a newer version of Thanos. I just want to say that there are a couple variations of Thanos out there that I think are very good. There's a death version of Thanos. There also is a junk version of Thanos that runs cards like Viper. I've played them, I've tested them, but this, I don't know what to call this. Like, it's like an ongoing Thanos, I think is what to call it. It doesn't run Spectrum, but it is an ongoing Thanos, and I love it. It's quite well. So, my main takeaway for this video is that I feel like the meta currently is reasonable. I feel like the Sandman Galactus decks are largely overrated. And if you have a viable build or use one of these other decks that are good, you can climb. It's definitely an open meta with a lot of good decks. I do think the Darkhawk and the Patriot decks are on top right now. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Also, let me know what's working for you. I'm sure there's a lot of good experiences out there right now. Maybe even with Galactus and Electro ramp players. I don't know. Bye for now.